When the police arrest someone on suspicion of serial murder, they'll pursue every avenue available in a bid to encourage the guilty party to confess. When no confession is forthcoming, the police will sometimes turn to a person the killer trusts and ask them for help. In today's episode, we'll examine the confession of one of America's most controversial murderers. Murder, especially serial murder, is usually a man's business. Not in today's episode. Nicknamed the Damsel of Death, she died on death row in 2002 following her conviction for killing 6 men when she worked as a sex worker on Florida's highways between 1989 and 1990. Originally claiming to have killed in self-defense after being raped by her clients, she later admitted to planning the murders with robbery as her motive. However, after her arrest, she refused to cooperate with the police. Investigators therefore turned to her ex-girlfriend, a young woman called Tyra Moore. A series of recorded phone calls between the two women followed, with the aim of ensnaring the suspect and bringing about a confession. This method is highly controversial because there have been incidents where it's led to false confessions being made in order for one party to take the whole blame for a crime which otherwise would have been shared. Who's the killer in question? Aileen Wuornos. In July 1990, Aileen Wuornos was arrested by the Florida State Police. She was suspected of having shot in cold blood a man who had solicited her for sex. Within days, Wuornos would find herself in the frame for a total of 6 murders. If found guilty, she'd become one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. However, repeated attempts by detectives to question her about her alleged involvement in the crimes were met with silence.
Wuornos came from a background of being fairly hardened and being, as it were, in the kind of area where people were forensically aware because they had to be, because they had so many encounters with the law. So when she was arrested, she basically said nothing.
She stonewalled the cops. They could not get beneath the surface. They could not get a response from her on anything to do with the murders she was accused of. And then they worked out that the love of her life, Tyra, was the key to the entire situation.
Tyra Moore was a young woman who'd been in a relationship with Wuornos for some time. Witnesses had seen Moore with Wuornos in the vicinity of at least one of the murders.
Hey, Ty?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Nothing. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing. I'm sitting here in jail.
Yeah, it's what I heard. There's been officials up at my parents' house asking some questions.
Uh-oh.
And I'm getting scared.
I think what happened is there was pictures in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a case of mistaken identity.
In the days that followed, the calls between the two women continued, with Moore sounding increasingly desperate, and Aileen Wuornos pushed ever closer to the cliff edge of confession.
I don't know whether I should keep on living or if I should...
No, Ty.
What?
You go ahead and let us know what you need to know. You want to know that you're innocent. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
This was more than Wuornos could actually stand. Wuornos suddenly was ready to actually spill the beans to protect the love of her life.
She's a real
this is an honourable component of Aileen Wuornos. This feeling and this desire to defend Ty, as she calls it, is actually an honourable component of her. And within the confession, she's very keen to emphasise that. She realises, this is a killer who does realise that this is it, that her life is going to change from this point, that it's all over. This is a person who is aware of that in the confession scenario, and therefore she's drawing upon that which is good within her, that which is honourable within her, and her feelings and her relationship with Ty, I think, are that.
Aileen Wuornos is perhaps known as one of America's worst female serial killers. I've interviewed quite a few of them in the United States, but she's notorious. Aileen, I call her Lee, was literally born on the wrong side of the tracks. Her father was a child molester who'd spent a lot of time in prison. The mother, she was an unwanted child. And Lee was passed on at a very early age, around about the age of 9 or 10.
I think her own grandfather abused her, she later claimed, and it seems to have been a true claim. And he even sort of rented her out to other friends of his to have sex with. And this is all under the age of 14. It's horrific stuff and very disturbing for a child. And without doubt, it warped her mentality. It made her lose track with any moral compass whatsoever, and possibly with reality, because her life was horrendous.
Around about that age, she started turning into prostitution. She would sell her body to local boys for a packet of cigarettes or so, to a point where she got pregnant. Her child was taken into care, and Lee disappeared off the face of the map. She went south. This girl went through a terrible, terrible, terrible childhood, and anybody that reads her story can't fail to be upset by it. When Lee effectively left home, she was streetwise. I mean, she'd go and play pool. She was known to drink. Some of her story is quite funny. You know, she married an 80-year-old man when she was about 17, took him to the cleaners, and she slowly drifted south, where she met a woman called Taria Moore, a young woman, and they fell in love. And they ended up somewhere around about Daytona Beach renting an apartment.
She was someone who became the love of Wuornos' life, someone who would almost save her from a lifetime of turmoil and prostitution, someone who would make her feel that there was something good within her.
Tyra was the one that shocked her. She made a deal with the police so that she would have immunity, and Aileen would end up on death row, basically.
What the police did was they had the weaker Taria Moore, who did not have a history like that. She hadn't really no criminal history at all. So they leaned on her. They went to her home. They bothered her parents. They sweated her. And Taria, look, tell us all about it, otherwise you're going to go to the chair. You know, Lee's already told us you're involved. That sort of common and garden police tactic to get somebody to confess. And they sat there while she phoned Lee in jail.
Hey, Ty?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Nothing. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing. I'm sitting here in jail.
Yeah, it's what I heard.
Listen, I gotta ask you something. Is there anybody in that room?
No, just me.
What?
What?
Is there anybody in your room?
No.
Here we have a situation where a woman who is the lover of Aileen is encouraged to talk to her on the phone And Aileen is even given that phone number where she can contact her lover, and during those conversations she starts to admit the murders she refused to admit before this moment. And that in itself seems manipulative. It feels that the police and law enforcement were pushing a situation into an unnatural set of circumstances during which the suspect finally admits the crimes they've committed. And I'm not sure, and a lot of people are not sure, whether this is the right way to go about law enforcement.
There is obviously more than a suggestion of entrapment. The police knew that Taria Moore was the weak link. They used that against Wuornos, even when they had plenty of evidence to convict her for at least 6 of the homicides. And they used Taria Moore as a tool when they had no need to. They knew that Lee would protect her, being the more dominant of the couple. Lee would have given her life for Taria Moore.
Serial killer Aileen Wuornos was dubbed the Damsel of Death by the press. Now cutting-edge lip-sync technology can bring her controversial confessions to life. The secretly recorded conversations with her lover Moore were the catalyst for Wuornos opening up to her interrogators. She demanded to speak to detectives. What followed was a rambling, disconnected, disordered dissertation that revealed little about the crimes, but acted as a sterling defense of her lover and as an admission of her own guilt.
There was a gush, if you like, of confused and jumbled information, the kind of information that would be produced by an ordinary person who had been through the mills, been through hell, and was kind of confused and putting things together. And this was not the words of a calculating, cold-blooded, psychopathic killer who would have been much more organised in their story, less emotionally disturbed, and very clear and succinct in what they were saying.
I think she's quite clearly making a statement that her lover had nothing to do with it, that her lover was totally innocent and knew nothing about it, even though there's a lot of evidence to suggest that her lover knew a lot more that was going on. She is basically saying, my lover's innocent, I'm the guilty one, I'll take the rap, and that's what she does.
I have spent months and months working on this case, and I gained access to material that the public have never seen. I know for a fact that Taria Moore was present when at least at least one of those murders was committed. Absolutely present. Because the 2 girls bought something at a gas station, and they were recorded on CCTV buying some products. And the receipt and the gas station put those 2 girls in a murdered man's car the afternoon of the time he was shot. From where they were, she had to be in that car when this man was shot. So I think Taria Moore had more than an inkling that Lee was a serial killer.
It seems that Aileen discovered her true self through Taria, but there was also a lot of anger involved in this relationship. And the two women did seem to taunt each other at times.
Wuornos and Moore were trying to build what, on the surface at least, had the appearance of a normal relationship. Despite having very little money, they managed to set up home together. But any outward appearance of domesticity hid a volatility behind closed doors. Arguments invariably revolved around a lack of funds and were often fueled by alcohol. As the older of the two women, Wuornos took it upon herself to be the breadwinner. But unable to secure a regular job, she turned to the only real trade she had ever known: prostitution.
There's a great irony in this, because of course she was now with the so-called love of her life, another woman, and yet she was having to go out and have sex with men in order to make sure that relationship survived and that she could finance it in an effective way. Aileen was introduced to prostitution, and I suppose you could say worked as a prostitute from an incredibly early age. And this undoubtedly made her believe that being a prostitute was a way to make a living. And in an environment where it was difficult to get work anyway, and she'd left school early, she had no qualifications, it was almost natural to her to slide into the career of being a prostitute.
Okay, Michael, Aileen Wuornos. Now, I have to admit that I've always felt a degree of sympathy for Aileen Wuornos, and I'm perfectly willing to be dissuaded from that sympathy. Do you buy any of the things that we heard, though, about her saying that she killed in self-defense? She kills her clients in self-defense because they were going to rough her up, they were going to beat up on her.
No, because there's other actions that she could have taken. So she could have run away.
But equally, she says, I wished I'd never picked up a gun, I wished I'd never become a hooker. This is somebody who really did have an absolutely dreadful life.
But she still made the choices to pick up the gun and to become a hooker.
Well, her choices were incredibly limited, though. I mean, again, one of the things that's the bedrock of our criminal justice systems, whether we're talking about the United States or whether we're talking about the United Kingdom, is the idea of responsibility. And it seems to me, though, her responsibility is partial, limited. This woman has had the most appalling set of circumstances thrown to her in her childhood, and therefore, is it any surprise that she ends up as a sex worker? I mean, I think that...
But it's a sex worker who then goes on to kill. So actually, if she knew she was getting into a situation in which she was likely to be roughed up and beaten, why perpetuate that? Why not stop at that point? Why not choose an alternative occupation?
Aileen didn't seem to have a lot of sense of danger, and as such, when she was working as a prostitute, she was working as a freeway hooker, and that is the most dangerous part of an already dangerous profession. This is about hitchhiking for men to stop their cars on the hard shoulder of the motorway and offer them sex. And that usually meant getting into the car with them, driving off and finding a lonely, isolated, very dark lane where they could have sex. She then received her money, and that was the end of the transaction. And the men she was meeting were expecting her in many ways to be violent, and they wanted to be violent to her. And this expectation seems to have gelled with her anger that she already felt for many men and for life in general, because until she met Taria, she had had a miserable life, and of course her childhood had been absolutely appalling.
Many female serial killers, especially the ones that use a knife, like the English killer Joan Dennehy, hated men with a passion. She loved blood. But this cannot be said of Aileen Wuornos, not at all. She was social in bars, she enjoyed bikers' company. As I said, she's been with 200 men, and most of them said that she was very fair and straight with them and very good fun and everything else. She didn't hate men. This is a picture of her that's been painted over decades, and many decades, that she's a hater of men. It is completely and utterly untrue. What she didn't like was the fact that she, as a young child, up to the age of about 11 or 12, she was abused by her in-laws and the man that stood over and beat her and thrashed her. And so I think that when these men started to abuse her in the cars, all this came flooding back, and she lost the plot.
I still say to myself, and still say that this is self-defense, because most of them either going to start speaking up or going to screaming at, no, anyone don't ask.
Now, if you're a client just treating her with respect as such, and you're treating her gently, and she's given the client sex, she's in control. She knows what he wants, he knows what he wants. It's an amicable, almost, if you like, a business relationship. But there are men, and certainly the ones that she killed, that went beyond that deal. They broke that deal. They wanted more. They wanted to treat her like trash. They wanted her to strip off. They wanted to punch her and do terrible things to her when they were alone in a car. They wanted to treat that woman like dirt. And it got to that point where she just, all her memories of her youth and childhood came back to her. And she was defenseless against these men without some sort of weapon. And in her bag, she carried a revolver. And that point came when eventually she says, I can't deal with this anymore. Stop it, stop it. And then she shot them.
And then as I get away from that, run to the front of the car or jump over the seat or whatever, grab my gun and just start shooting. Which they would be out of the car, most of them would be nude. And they just close the car. And then they, didn't think I'll run back in the car or anything. I would start shooting out from out of the car and shoot out.
One of the reasons that people confess is to try and in some way or another justify their actions. Whether or not they are admitting that directly or not, that's what it's about. Almost always, that's what a confession is about. And we see that very readily in the case of Aileen Wuornos. We see her talking about how she had to do what she did because otherwise she was going to get beaten up. We see her talking about how it just happened as she was trying to defend herself. So a very clear psychological purpose, somebody trying to justify what they've done.
My impression of the woman is an enormous degree of bitter alienation, and I think it's extraordinary that a woman who seems to me to have been a promiscuous lesbian prostitute would continue to go back to doing that if she felt so abused in that scenario. So it's fascinating in the confession when she talks about her victims, and ultimately it seems to me that she is a predator. She becomes a predator, and that liberates her to do what she did.
My reading of the way she describes events and how she felt the need to defend herself within her confession does suggest to me that Aileen Wuornos is speaking the truth, that this is how she experienced the situations, how she felt about what was happening. Now, whether or not that's reality, or whether that's all distorted by her own perception of what she was doing, her own understanding of what she was doing, I'm not sure.
With Wuornos' situation deteriorating by the hour, she was informed that her conversations with Moore had been recorded by the police, and that this had been done with Moore's full cooperation. But even this news would not dissuade Wuornos from continuing to protect her lover, and only strengthened her resolve to shoulder complete blame for the murders.
3 times confessing that there's nothing there is no. I'm telling you from the bottom of my heart, I'm telling you the truth about everything. I mean, I can't be any truthful. I told you, I don't care if you're here or not, I just want to let them understand that Tyra is very innocent. I don't want an innocent person hurt.
When you invest that much in someone and you find someone that you believe you love and that you can trust and confide in, and you then protect that person by giving this for her, ultimate sacrifice of confessing to being a serial killer, to then be betrayed by that person would be extraordinarily difficult. And yet for her, she probably has such a chronicle of betrayal that it doesn't surprise her.
Your average psychopathic serial killer is unlikely to sacrifice themselves in order to save someone else grief. In the case of Wuornos, she clearly put herself into the firing line in order to spare Taria Moore any kind of intervention by the police. In fact, she kind of released this information to them on the understanding that they would not actually pursue the love of her life.
Aileen Wuornos was working as a sex worker in Florida when she murdered 6 of her clients. Her emotional audio recordings, some made without her knowledge as part of a sting, have now been reanimated using lip-sync technology, offering a new look at this complex and controversial killer.
I still say to myself, I still say that this is self-defense.
After the first chaotic interview, Wuornos returned to her jail cell with police officers little wiser as to what had motivated her. However, now realizing that the murders were now firmly pinned upon her, she did what so many serial killers before her have done. She made a confession that tried to rationalize her crimes and paint herself as the victim.
She did not particularly want to take the full blame. She didn't particularly at this point in time want to go to the death chambers. What she actually came up with was a kind of compromise. She would just present this as, yes, I actually did kill these people, but it was all in self-defense. She extrapolated from the very first time when she was raped and she retaliated with a gun, and just made it seem as if that scenario had been repeated, albeit a lot of times.
There are so many grey areas with Aileen Wuornos. For example, she claimed during her confession to these murders that some of the men, if not all of them, had tried to assault her, and this had hastened her decision to kill them. There's no doubt that there was a certain element of violence on their part towards her, and obviously ultimately from her to them. But where is this line? Where do we draw this line where it becomes cold-blooded murder and it becomes murder or a killing carried out partly in defense of your own life?
They got violent with me and I decided to be done with them.
female serial killer, we should talk gender. You know, usually female serial killers are angels of death, people working in healthcare settings. But here we've got a female serial killer, a sex worker, using firearms to kill. That's really unusual.
It is.
And therefore, to what extent do we see Wuornos as someone that's an outlier, not somebody who is typical of the genre?
Well, female offending is typically for minor offences and not for acts of violence, although that's increasingly the case amongst younger women. And certainly sort of homicide is extremely rare.
One of the problems with her lifestyle was that she was likely to be robbed, she was likely to be beaten up by truckers and by people that picked her up. So in a sense, it made sense for her to be armed. But where she went beyond that was that she started to say these men were raping her or engaging in anal sex when she didn't want to engage in anal sex, and therefore she had to stop them, and she used the gun to stop them. And she killed 6 or 7 men by shooting them. And that sounds very plausible until you look at the post-mortem and you find that instead of just one shot, she was shooting 6 or 7 shots at a time, basically emptying the gun on the victim. Overkill. And in many ways that was indicative of the anger that she felt when she'd been abused by yet another male. And it was very much a male abuse that she was suffering from. She saw her sexual work as a means of supporting her and her lover, but she also was getting abused by these men. Now, whether they actually did abuse her or whether that was her perception of abuse is uncertain, but clearly she went overboard and shooting these men 6, 7 times, way beyond any self-defense. I think without any doubt she projected onto these men a sense of betrayal, her anger at being abused. They were the men, the 50s and 60s, were the age group that abused her earlier in her life. So she's just repeating the same abuse. Now, whether they actually abused her or not is debatable, but we're looking at her perception. Her perception is that these are abusers. I need to protect myself against them. And at the same time get revenge on society for what society's allowed to happen to her as a child. But she's also, it's multifactorial because she's driven by the need for money. She's driven by the need to look after her lover, as well as dealing with the perception of the abuse that she's getting from these men. So several factors running at the same time, and that's what makes it quite interesting but also quite complex case.
Michael, I'm really interested in motivation in Wuornos's case because it seems to me there's a great deal of confusion about what might have motivated her, partly caused by herself. What do you think is driving the sequence of murders?
I think it is to do with revenge in terms of how she was treated, because she did have opportunities not to carry out those killings. And therefore she's in creating that confusion, that mist around why did she do it, to try and explain to others in a way that she thinks they will accept, rather than it simply being she wanted to get men back for what they'd done to her.
So you think revenge is motive enough for her?
It isn't. I think this seems to me to be the predominant motive in this particular case. Doesn't justify it, but it does seem to me to be the predominant reason. Now, there's many other young people who have been abused as children who don't go on to kill. We mentioned it's a rarity amongst female offenders. We know that most abuse occurs against females, so their actions quite often are to internalise it, to be much more sort of suicidal, to be much more negative about themselves and not to take actions against perpetrators. But in this case, this is clearly what she does. She didn't have to shoot. She didn't have to get the gun. She didn't have to be a hooker. She went down that path.
I think the apparent inconsistencies in the explanations are fitting with what we know about human beings and the psychology of all human beings, which is actually that we don't have a single motivation for anything that we do, and that we're not always clear on what our motivations are, and that we're much more emotionally led than we realise. And I think that just comes out in the confession. She's both of these explanations are part of the picture, are part of why she did what she did. They're only still part of the picture, but they both are valid. And she's moving in and out of the different explanations according to her feelings, according to who she's being interviewed by and the context. So I don't think my sense of Aileen Wuornos is that this isn't a deliberate attempt to negotiate, or it's not strategic. It's somebody who isn't entirely clear about why she did what she's done, and now she's trying to face up to it, and she's drawing on all the different emotions and thoughts within her to make sense of it.
Aileen Wuornos is one of the most controversial serial killers of the 20th century. But were her murders committed in cold blood or acts of self-defense? Lip-sync technology now allows us to judge Wuornos and her crimes in a new light.
I would start shooting out around the car, she said.
Wuornos's confessions clearly demonstrate that she was a complex personality who was ultimately driven to confess out of love and loyalty to her ex-lover Moore. This kind of empathy for others is rarely apparent in the behaviour of psychopathic murderers who quite simply can't genuinely feel for other people. What this serves to illustrate is why controversy still reigns around Aileen Wuornos and whether she should ever have been executed for the crimes for which she ultimately willingly confessed to.
It would be right to say that Lee literally dug her own grave. She was stacked up against law enforcement that obtained Terry Moore's confession and used her like some sort of tool. Corrupt police officers that were offered bribes and money from film companies. And you have the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the FDLE, have got a coup. They've caught a serial killer, a female serial killer of everything that's gone around shooting people. Her reputation with her criminal record, which wasn't up to much, and the fact that she was a hooker, everything was stacked against her, right from day one. As for executing Aileen Wuornos, I can't see what purpose that served at all.
It seems that Aileen Wuornos was a victim to a certain degree. I mean, she did commit the murders, let's not pretend otherwise, but it feels as if because her victims were white middle-class men and her pursuers, the police, were, most of them, similar profiles, that they, in a sense, decided that she was a heartless, cold-blooded person. And yet, when you look at what she did by confessing these murders, she protected Tyria and at the same time literally sentenced herself to death.
It is interesting to note that Wuornos was clearly not entirely psychopathic. She was borderline. She was explosive as a character. She was a little bit crazy and paranoid. However, she possibly didn't actually show that she was an ongoing danger to others. She clearly had killed people, but under great duress and under circumstances where most rules and regulations had gone out the window. Yet she was still put to death by the state.
Ultimately, I feel it's justified when the end justifies the means, and the end here was significant. If you're talking about preventing someone from killing other people, I think extreme measures can be justified. Ethically, I think there's a point beyond which the argument for rehabilitation doesn't hold. I think ultimately people have to pay for their crimes, even if the crimes and the magnitude of the crimes are beyond cost. I think to allow someone to live in the knowledge of what they've done, of that magnitude of depravity, is in itself an injustice.
Despite confessing to her crimes, Aileen Wuornos was executed in October 2002.
It's just a very sad case. It really was a sad case. You feel that in many ways it was almost inevitable. She was a very, very unstable character, but that was because of the very nature of her background. She'd been so abused for so often by so many different people. She had no real concept of what a normal relationship was. She had no real concept of what life is like for most people. She had a very bizarre perception of life from her background. And in many ways, she was very angry. In one of her last confessions, she blamed society and the community for her problems. And in many ways, they were. Society let her down over a long period of time.
The life and death of Aileen Wuornos is a tragedy in every respect. From her own childhood to the American justice system, it all seems warped, it all seems a failure. It seems that the system or systems did not work in either respect.
In some ways it's a more upsetting confession for me psychologically, because you can see the way in which events have unfolded for somebody who is basically fairly human, but has been caught up and carried along in a chain of events that has led to her being where she is now.
The case of Aileen Wuornos is unlike any other. Everyone in the story is a victim, from Wuornos herself to the men that she murdered.